Great. We have a lot to talk about today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Forum webinar series. My name, if you don't know me, is Priya Chaya, and I am the Associate Director of Content for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. In case you don't know, this webinar is presented by Preservation Leadership Forum, which is the professional membership program of the National Trust. This webinar series is made possible by members of Forum, and we sincerely thank those of you who are with us today. Before we begin, there are a few logistics. We will take questions from the audience during the webinar, but ask that you send those via the Q&A function directly to the panelists. That's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You're welcome to submit questions at any point during the webinar, but we will be waiting until the Q&A period at the end to answer questions. You're also encouraged to communicate with each other through the chat function. The closed captioning function is enabled for this webinar. You can enable it and disable it either through the controls at the bottom of your Zoom screen or through your audio settings. It sort of depends on what version of Zoom you're using. As a reminder, we ask that everyone is respectful to each other in the chat and follow our code of conduct, which Colleen, my colleague, will share in the chat in a moment. Ooh, I'm really excited that you're all here today. Today's webinar is called Our Missing History, Building a Toolkit for Change, which comes out of the LA Women's Landmarks Project, a joint effort between the National Trust's Where Women Made History program and the Los Angeles Conservancy. And today we're trying something new. Instead of our regular format, which is panelists talking to slides and then going one after each other, myself and Rhonda Sienkiewicz, the National Trust Director of Education, are going to have a conversation with our speakers, Chris Morris, the Senior Director for Preservation Programs and Where Women Made History at the National Trust, and Arabella Delgado, the lead researcher for the LA Women's Landmarks Project. Because this isn't our usual format, we really hope that you'll let us know what you think in the follow-up survey. Finally, we'll be talking throughout this session about a variety of different pieces that are in the toolkit that Chris and Arabelle have put together based on their work and experiences with the LA Women's Landmarks program. I wanted to emphasize now that we will be sharing that material along with the recording of today's session and the slide deck directly to the email you used to register. In fact, you can download the toolkit right now. Colleen is sharing a hot off the presses story by our American Conservation Experience and Mellon Humanities postdoctoral fellow, Sarah Palecki, who is also running the slides. Thank you, Sarah. And that includes the download link, and which will be where the recording will be embedded later today. Finally, as a reminder, all of our recordings of our webinars are also on our YouTube channel. So with all of those logistics out of the way, we're going to get started with saying hi to Chris Morris. Hi, Chris Morris. Welcome to the webinar.
Thanks for having us here today. We're excited to talk to you about all the work that we've been doing.
Amazing. I think we probably just start at the beginning. And can you tell us a little bit more about what the LA Women's Landmarks Project is?
Absolutely. So for those of you who might be hearing about this for the first time, the Los Angeles Women's Landmarks Project is a joint project between, as Priya said, the National Trust and the Los Angeles Conservancy, which is where I'm based for the National Trust. And as is my wonderful colleague, Arabella, we're both here in LA. And it's really intended to kind of rethink and fundamentally change the way that we recognize women's contributions to history. We will get into this a little bit more, but this project is multifaceted. We're taking a number of different approaches to really change how we think about how women are a part of our history, the way that we fully recognize them, and particularly intersectional women's histories as a part of the work of historic preservation. And in doing so, hopefully get people to kind of change how they think about what the baseline is for history and the ways that we designate history.
Awesome. I've been so honored to hear about this project since you started working on it. And so I know that there was like a particular moment or a moment of epiphany, which sort of pushed you in the Conservancy saying, now is the right time, let's do this. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Of course. This is sort of the origin story of LA Women's Landmarks. If you can go to the next slide, please. So some of you may not be aware of, LA is an incredibly vibrant arts community, and it's also community that's full of all sorts of activism and social justice activism. What you're looking at right now is the studio of Sister Mary Carita Kent, who was often called the pop art nun, although that might be a little bit derogatory, but she was an incredibly important activist and artist and educator here in Los Angeles. Her studio was a very unassuming, like concrete brick or concrete block studio in Hollywood, but she was incredibly significant in the art world, in the activism world, and you can see sort of the vibrancy of her screen printing work that she did, a lot of which was rooted in the Catholic faith, of which she was a part of, part of the order that she was a part of, but also in the social justice and civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s. She was not only significant here in Los Angeles, she was internationally significant. And during the pandemic, her studio was threatened with demolition by a developer. And the Cultural Heritage Commission was considering designation of this as a way to help recognize that and protect it. Unfortunately, the recommendation from the city staff at that time was that this studio, which was the source of so much of her work and so much influence within the arts community and the activism community here and across the globe, their recommendation was not to designate. Not because this site wasn't significant, not because Sister Mary Carita wasn't significant, but because the building didn't have integrity. And again, we're talking about a concrete block building. Long story short, they had the hearing, and literally, this was during the pandemic, over 100 people from around the world called in to make the case for the impact of Sister Mary Carita Kent and her pedagogy and her artwork and her activism. And so at the end of the day, the commission changed course. They actually did decide to designate her studio, which was a huge victory. But it showed me, if this is how difficult it is, if this is the challenge that is faced by an internationally recognized woman artist and an activist to get designated, what hope do we have of other women's histories, particularly intersectional and diverse women's histories, being recognized? And so that was a real light bulb moment for me of just how difficult it is to get sites of women's history recognized.
Can you, next slide, Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about why LA?
Of course. So for those of you who aren't from Los Angeles, you may not think of Los Angeles as being a hotbed of historic preservation, but it absolutely is. They have one of the oldest ordinances in the country, and they have really been on the cutting edge of doing really innovative historic preservation work over the last several decades. And what I point to here is Survey LA, which was a collaboration between the Los Angeles Conservancy and the city and the Getty to literally survey the entire city of Los Angeles, which was unheard of at that time, and I still think is pretty unusual. Not many other cities have tackled a project of this scope and scale. So this is not unusual for Los Angeles to be on the frontier of trying new things in terms of the field of historic preservation. So we felt like, given my presence here and the LA Conservancies and our commitment to gender equity and racial equity in our work, this was the perfect laboratory to try to develop a new way of thinking about historic designations. And you'll see it's because one of the other reasons is because Los Angeles, since they created their ordinance in 1962, they've designated over 1,320 historic cultural monuments, which are what LA calls their local landmarks. Our review of those shows that 2% of those are designated for women's history, and that is an abysmal number, but it is unfortunately not an unusual number. So we wanted to try to create a new model here in Los Angeles that hopefully can inspire other cities to follow our lead across the country.
Thanks. So amazing. Yeah, so great.
So Chris and Arabella, you had sort of the right moment in time, this inspiration from the designation of Mary Carita Kent, and the right place with LA already sort of being a trailblazer in survey and documentation. What are some of the assumptions or information that you had that helped define the larger scope of this work and the approach that you needed to begin the work in LA, but hopefully make this something that is replicable in other places?
If you want to go to the next slide, Sarah. Sure. Yeah. thanks. So we really started from this fundamental problem, which is you can see the numbers for yourself. LA is not alone in the sort of the lack of designation of women's history. This is not a new problem. This is something that has existed for decades. It's an issue that women and others in the preservation community have tried to tackle many times over the last several decades. But that really low level of representation is emblematic across pretty much every level of recognition and designation that you can think of. And Sarah Pilecki, for those of you who are interested, actually did the research on our National Historic Landmarks and confirmed that that number is also incredibly low too. So this is what we are trying to tackle. And this is not, so I want to emphasize this is not a new problem. And this is not an unusual problem. And so Arabella and the Conservancy and I really came together to think about how do you begin to tackle something that is this holistic, that this problem is so entrenched and so system-wide. Next slide, please. What came out of that was LA Women's Landmarks. We spent, Arabella can attest to this, so can my colleagues at the Conservancy. We spent a lot of time thinking about this. We know this is not going to be easy. We know that we also have to do this in a way that hopefully other people feel inspired by and feel that it is accessible to them to try some aspects of this work too. But these are the fundamental principles as we thought about this and planned this work over the course of about a year. These are the fundamental principles that we landed on, that we really wanted to find a way to transform the designation process for our purposes for intersectional women's stories, but in the process, reforming how we do designations in a way that then opens it up for all intersectional stories, all diverse people's stories that also have been admitted along with women's stories. We wanted to create a new national model that is much more equitable in terms of the ways that we do designations. So we're not just looking at past designations, we're really thinking about how we do designations in the future. And then we really wanted to think about how we turn all of this work into something that's very public facing. If these just become forms that go sit on a shelf somewhere and no one ever sees them, we haven't really changed how people understand how women shaped LA and how they engage with that history in their day-to-day lives. And then last but not least, we really wanted to try to model equity and gender equity and racial equity across the project as much as possible. And that really gets to the ways that we engaged our partners. We have this ever expanding group of people that we're working with, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But these are kind of the foundations on which LA Women's Landmarks is built. And Arabella, please jump in here if there's anything I'm missing.
Yeah, you are all good.
All right. So,
well, awesome. Arabella, I realize it might be helpful, and we didn't talk about this at a time. If you could talk about really quick how you came to the project, because I think that's really important for people to understand.
Yeah, so I'm actually a PhD candidate at USC, and I did my graduate certificate in heritage conservation. And so Trudy Sandmeyer, who we all love at heritage conservation here in LA, asked me if I needed a summer job because Chris had reached out to her, and she reached out to me, and that is how I came onto this project. Kind of just Trudy kind of facilitating all of this, which I'm really thankful for because I've absolutely loved being on this. And that was
Right.
2 summers ago now.
yeah, I was going to say you started, it was a summer internship that's now grown into Arabella has been invaluable as our lead researcher. So thank you, Trudy. Thank you, Arabella.
I think so much of what I've learned over the process of putting this session together is that none of this would have been possible without Arabella. So, Arabella, I mean, I think now, next slide, Sarah. I think the question I had for you was, we've talked about the assumptions and the approach. Can you talk to us that now, we're at this point where you have to determine test the validity of doing something no one has done before. Can you talk us through what some of the initial steps that were needed to test these assumptions?
Right, yeah. So the very first step we had to do is kind of look at our assumption that women were underrepresented in historic cultural monuments, which are HCMs. And we needed to know exactly what that meant to really interrogate that further. And before I even came onto the project, Chris, along with local practitioners Sion Winship, Teresa Grimes, and Christy McAvoy, actually compiled a list of HCMs that they knew were associated with women's history, but may not have been designated for women's history. And they actually went through the 1,300 sites and kind of marked through them. And what ended up happening was we had a list of 43 sites that were like, these should have women's history in the designation. And so it's like, that's a good place to start. If they should, let's interrogate that. So I took those 43 sites and I did a more detailed analysis of those, and I was able to get the original nomination files from our Office of Historic Resources. And I started close reading each one to better understand just how women are represented. And very quickly in that process, kind of the scope of the problem became clear. And I really identified, which is on the screen, those like 5 key problems in these nominations. And so the first case is actually that women's history was not adequately conveyed intentionally or unintentionally. And as a result, the history of women were just not included in designation at all. And we see this in sites like Max Sennett Studios, which was a very popular production company during the silent film era. It is now a public storage facility. But director Mabel Normand was absolutely integral to running the studio and for its popularity. And she is actually even credited with the famous pie in the face comedy gag. That was her. She created that. She changed the genre of comedy. But she's actually not included in the nomination at all. So she's just not written in. In the next case, there are cases where women are included in the designation, but their contributions are diminished or overshadowed by other histories, meaning that the narrative's emphasis is on architecture, another male figure, or broader events, and women are kind of sprinkled in. We see this in case study house number 8. And even though Ray and Charles Eames, who designed the house, were partners in both life and work, Ray Eames is largely reduced to wife of Charles in the nomination, and her contribution to American design history is just a sentence buried in a more detailed explanation of Charles in the architectural description. And then even in sites that are designated for women's history, that history is rarely intersectional. And that sample that I looked at, like a pretty good number were designated specifically for the women's club movement. And those narratives tend to they use the same narrative, and oftentimes those themselves aren't even that well written. And so I don't necessarily want to diminish that history, but it's also saying that women's history can still be exclusionary. If the primary narrative is about white upper middle class women, that's leaving out all the other diverse women that have made contributions to our city, from the LGBT community, women from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, and women from different socioeconomic positions. And then we also see HCMs that are designated for women's history, but the significant statements diminish their contributions through a gender bias. A very clear example of this is the Gibbons Del Rio residence. So the second part of that name, Del Rio, is for Dolores Del Rio, who is incredibly important to film and Latinx history. But the preparer chose to focus only on her physical beauty. And so when discussing the decline of her Hollywood career, the preparer, in their own words, said that this occurred because, quote, movie moguls decided the time for her Latin beauty had passed, even if she looked as good as ever, end quote. And that was written in 2015. So we have kind of these 4 kind of fundamental problems with the way women's narratives are written. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you have excellent nominations that tell very detailed and diverse stories of LA women. And an example being the International Institute in Boyle Heights. But the professionalization of the HCM process makes these types of nominations really difficult for the average community member to carry out. So in policy, HCMs are an open process. Anyone can nominate a site, but policy doesn't always translate into practice. And successful nominations that get through this multi-step process do require extensive research and often access to materials that are behind paywalls or even at universities and archives. And of course, we know that historically under-recognized communities don't always have the privilege of significant archival traces or easily accessible information, which makes this research even harder to do. So these were like the general trends that came out from my overview of 43 sites. But if we go to the next slide, you can,
If I can
oh
interject
yeah,
real quick.
of course.
Arabella talked about the report she wrote. She talked about the Max Sennett Studios. We have provided a version of Arabella's report, not the full original
Yeah.
60-something pages. This one's a little bit shorter by half. And a example of the Max Sennett Studio evaluation for you to see some examples of the work they did as you go through the elements of the toolkit. Arabella.
Yeah, and so this is actually an example of a form that I did. And the reason why I have these forms that are available to use as a template is I needed a process to work through 43 sites in the way that I could get the same type of information in the sample size, even as these nominations were written from like 1962 to the present with varying degrees of quality and quantity of information. So on the screen, you're going to see an example of the form, and it's broken up into a couple of parts. So I first identified basic information included in the nomination form, even including the original preparer, in case we ever wanted to reach out to them and say if they were even interested in maybe adding to their own research. I then have an overview of the significance statement, which is a summary and a close reading of what was actually in the narrative in the nomination. And then another section called Potential for Women's Heritage Amendment, and then resources for further research. What's really important in this is the potential for Women's Heritage Amendment. I wanted to pinpoint the exact problems with women's representation in individual sites, not just broadly speaking, but to understand the work that actually needs to be done to include women's contributions. And so this information is then meant to inform the proposed amendment process. So if we're going to go back and we're going to look at these designations and we're going to interrogate them and we're going to add an amendment, like what actually needs to be done both on an individual and a structural level. And so as a part of that was also identifying that LA does not currently have an amendment process, which is what we're advocating for, and then nor do a lot of cities. So as a part of this work, we actually became curious of like, we know that LA doesn't have an amendment process. That's what we're trying to work towards. But do other cities have this capability? Can other people actually do this? So I actually did a quick search of historic preservation ordinances across 10 cities in the US to see if an amendment in any form actually exists in policy, even if it's not used in practice. And so I did find that some cities actually have an amendment written into their preservation ordinances, but it's typically unclear what that means, or there's actually not a separate process for amending a site, meaning if someone wanted to add information, they would have to go through the entire process again, which I think certainly serves as a barrier. And then also amendments are typically tied to the ability to rescind a designation altogether, which is something that we definitely do not want. We want to add information, not take it away. And for cities that do have amendments in their ordinances, I actually did a search of the amendment or of the ordinance. I found the ordinance number, went through meeting minutes for individual cities. I'm sorry, I hear you. I will slow down. My apologies. So I then found the ordinance number, went through individual cities' meeting minutes, found where it may have been used to see if amendments were actually used in practice. And so, for example, the city of Miami actually does have an amendment that people use, but they use it to actually decrease the boundaries for historic districts. So seeing as this process is maybe not fully thought through, not just in LA, but across the country, that's why we are advocating for an amendment process. And we hope that you all look into your ordinances as well.
That's an incredible amount of research. And I did want to take a beat right here to let you know that please, if you've got questions at any point, use the Q&A panel to let us know, and we will take a look at them for the end. It's just an enormous amount of work to look nationwide, even though you're limited to a couple of cities. And so I think what you've done the evaluations, you've gone through these 43 HCMs. At what point did you start to think about the external factors, to think about things like impacts and priorities, about which ones you wanted to move forward with and what made the most sense to take the next steps with?
Yeah, so we can go to the next slide. We'll
This
see.
question is for both you and Chris, maybe? Yeah,
Yeah,
whoever makes the most sense.
I can start and then if you'd like,
I,
yeah,
but I want you to talk about the impacts from it, but I want to emphasize like the importance, like the just how significant this research that Arabella has done for us is. We entered into this with a lot of assumptions. A lot of this was anecdotal information. We know women are underrepresented, just like we know other racial and socioeconomic and religious identities are underrepresented. What we didn't know was in what ways and by how much. So this moved from being just sort of anecdotal information to being data driven. Now we have an assessment and an understanding of just exactly how are women represented within the ways that we formally recognize historic sites within Los Angeles. Now we also understand the opportunities to begin to correct that problem. And none of that would have been possible without this research that Arabella did for us. But we also wanted to then, and hence the toolkit, make that process and those tools available to other communities, like learn from, our long, slow process and what we went through, and then how we have now crystallized that into tools that you can use to tackle this at whatever level you want in your own community. So I wanted to make sure that there was an understanding of just how groundbreaking this work is. So thank you, Arabella.
yeah, it was fun to go through. I don't know if everyone else would think it was fun, but I did. So, so we did all of that work and we have these 43 sites, but to move forward, we couldn't just focus on all 43. That's a lot of work. So we needed to find a way to narrow down kind of what are we going to target first. And so this is where we came back with our impact score. And I actually was inspired by a scoring system after I attended Pass Forward in New Orleans. I actually saw a talk about how the folks at UC Berkeley had to adapt like their historic campus to meet accessibility needs for their students, and they actually created their own impact factor to determine which places, like which buildings, sidewalks do they start with first to have the best impact for their students. And so I worked with Chris and then Lindsay Mulcahy, who was formerly at the Conservancy, to create a scoring system that reflects project goals and then organizational goals. So it's a two-parter. The explanation and the template are also available in the toolkit. But the first part is like a checklist. Ideally, what kind of sites would we want to focus on? What do they represent? So the first being an underrepresented neighborhood. So I did actually go through the list of HCMs by community plan area in Los Angeles and determine the number of HCMs per neighborhood in LA. So we have a list of actually which are the most underrepresented neighborhoods geographically. We also want to focus on intersectional history. We want to make sure that the community is interested, that they use the site or want it saved or they want women's history added to it. Ideally, owner support, council member support, and integrity. And we define integrity broadly as it resembles what it once was. And then the second part is intended to be this conversation of kind of all the different factors that determine the priority level of getting this work done. So one being, are there other interested groups? Are there other advocacy organizations, community organizations that would also want to share the work with us and partner? We also have to consider the level of work it actually takes to add women to the designation. How much work is it going to take? Do we have to go to archives? Is it available online? We also wanted to consider threat level. Is there something that needs to be done immediately? And then also, is this precedent setting? Obviously, the whole project is precedent setting, but we wanted to make sure that we were pushing the boundaries of preservation practice. So not just writing in women, but are we maybe including methods that aren't used as often? Like how about oral histories, or are there community archives that maybe that individual families hold that we can use? Thinking about kind of those more like community-driven sources of information. This then results in a number, the higher being the better, that helps us categorize sites into very high, high, medium, and low priority for our project.
This system is incredibly important for us because as we've gone back through the 1,320 HCMs again. We really want our decision making. We can't do, we've now identified over 100 of those existing historic landmarks that really have the potential to have women's history and that really should be evaluated and amended to put in that missing women's history. LA Women's Landmarks in this project don't have the capacity to do 100 amendments. As much as we would love to, we're kind of we're ginning up this machine and hoping that others will follow in our footsteps and tackle this work. So really creating the path for them to follow. And it was really important to us that we have a system that we can use as a way to begin to have an informed and again, data-driven conversation about the decisions that we're making to ensure that to the greatest extent possible, they're having the impact and the outcomes that we want, and they are aligned with the values of the project. So if we've got to choose from 43 or 100 sites, how do we collectively make smart decisions about which ones of those are going to have sort of hit the most of our values and our goals for the project? And this has been an incredibly valuable tool in doing that. It also isn't just Arabella and me. Like it's not just two people sitting around and making kind of arbitrary decisions about where are we going to work. We involve the Office of Historic Resources, the LA Conservancy staff, our consultant teams, our partners in these conversations. And this is a tool that allows us to have much more in-depth conversations and then make those very informed decisions. And if you go to the next slide, you can see the results of that. This is of those 100 places of the 43 that Arabella and the USC students researched and of the 100 places that we've identified, these are the ones that we've selected to be kind of the test cases for how to amend existing landmarks to add in missing women's history. So these are the 8 that we have selected using that impact scoring system, and really thinking about all of those factors that Arabella mentioned and how these are going to hopefully establish not only the path, but the precedent for how to add add in that history of women and women of all identities that was overlooked the first time around when they were designated.
Chris, that's really great. And I wanted to, I know Arabella mentioned this earlier, but every single tool and resource that they put together, we have put in this toolkit for you to see. At the end, we're going to go through the whole list so you can see everything that is available to you. But I just wanted to take a beat and emphasize that because I think it's important to know that part of this process was recognizing that this is not a problem isolated to Los Angeles, as Arabella has already said. And you had some goals as you worked through potential solutions about how to create a replicable model that others could use. So let's talk about that. Like, what were you thinking as you went through this process about how to make that happen?
Yeah, if you can go to the next slide. So I think I've mentioned this a few times, and this webinar is kind of one of the first forays into that. We really want to establish a new model with new tools that other people can use. Believe me, we understand how daunting this process is. Like, where do you even begin to take a bite out of an elephant that's this large and a problem that's this entrenched? Our overarching goal was to start to create tools that people have the ability to use, whether you were an individual, an organization, a Preservation Commission, city staff, whoever you are, you now are empowered to go use these tools and use them in whatever ways you want. You can start to interrogate just a couple of landmarks, your landmarking process in your own community, or you can do what we did and look at all of them. And we're starting to have those conversations with other commissions about how they can start to adopt some aspects or hopefully all aspects of the work that we're doing here. But having this model that other people can follow is absolutely critical because we understand, like you said, this problem isn't just contained to Los Angeles, it's nationwide. And then we really wanted to think about how we can inspire other people to get involved. So there is the work that we're going to be able to do as a part of LA Women's Landmarks. We only have so much capacity and so much funding, but we really wanted to kind of have that ripple effect and inspire other people to kind of like get on board this train that is now well down the track. And we have been really successful in that. We're seeing, I just got an email this morning from another person who said, how can I amend my historic cultural monument to add in the missing women's history? And that's exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to inspire with this work. And it's been amazing to see sites like Griffith Park, the Griffith Park Advisory Board, which is the largest, it's an incredibly historic site. It's also one of the largest metropolitan and municipal parks in the country. They approached us about, we really want to think about how we tell the story of Christina Griffith, not just Griffith J. Griffith. We're already starting to see that, and we want to be able to empower people to do this work themselves. That's the real impact here, if other people start adopting this model and doing this in their own communities.
Next slide, Sarah. Because it's not just about amending, right?
We spent 20 minutes talking about amendments, which is like one piece of the work. So there's a whole other component of this, which is about how we also do new designations. So like I said, we're not just looking backwards and how do we fix the things that perhaps were not done as well as they should have been, or intentionally weren't done as well as they should have been in the past, but how do we also look forward? How do we establish a model for how designation should be done in ways that actually center women's history and don't make them kind of an afterthought or a footnote to someone else's story. And so we have a list of, at this point, Arabella, what's it, like 260 potential historic cultural monuments of women's history?
I think we're pushing 300. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're going to pick at least 10 of those that are going to be now our models for how to do new historic cultural monument designations that really tell the full stories of the women who are at the centers of those stories. And I'm so thrilled to be able to say that the first one is the home of Etta James, just the incredibly talented multi-award singer, or multi-genre singer, who everyone knows, but almost no one knows that she lived for decades in this lovely little ranch house in a neighborhood called Athens on the Hill in Los Angeles with her family, and her sons lived there after she didn't live there. So this is very much a site that's associated with Etta James and the James family, but no one is aware of this. And this is our first in partnership with Council District 15, with the property owners, and with the incredibly active and passionate Athens on the Hill community. We're designating this as our first new historic cultural monument of women's history. as a part of LA Women's Landmarks. And Arabella, I want you to talk about the significance of this and from the community standpoint, please.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I went through the whole list of neighborhoods in LA to see if they have a number of HCMs. This is the only, not just like individual community, but community plan area is defined by LA that has 0 HCMs. So this will be its first historic cultural monument. And it's the only one that doesn't have any HCMs at the moment. So we're very excited to be the first.
Yeah, it's a community where not only has the women's history been ignored, all of the history. This is a historically African American neighborhood. So the entire history of this neighborhood has been ignored. And we're doing this nomination in a very collaborative way where we're working with a local archivist to do oral histories of the living history that resides in the community residents, some of whom have been there for 40, 50, 60 years. And then working with all of the residents to kind of explain the HCM process, which, as Arabella said, can be a little confusing and difficult. So to kind of give them an example of this is how this process works, and to be supportive of others in the neighborhood who are interested in having their homes designated or their properties designated as well.
Yeah.
I will just say, as the person who gets to help storytell a lot of this work, I can't wait to see those oral histories and see that great work from the community so we can share it with all of you, because Etta James is amazing and this is such an exciting piece of this project.
Yeah, building on that and the community driven aspect of this, I mean, obviously there's an incredible amount of, I would call it academic research that has gone into this project, but an important aspect that we touched on a little bit, and I'm hoping that you can elaborate a little bit more, are the partnerships and the collaborations with the community members that helped inform the types of sites and stories that are relevant to women's history and relevant to the community members. Can you talk a little bit about strategies for that?
Sure. Yeah. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I consider Arabella a part of that, and the USC graduate students that we were lucky enough to work with in a class last year. But we don't want this to be arbitrary. This isn't just me and some folks at the LA Conservancy and a handful of consultants sitting around and being like, oh, let's designate that and let's designate that. We wanted this to be driven by the community, by the representatives of local organizations and neighborhood groups and institutions, to understand the sites of women's history that were meaningful to them, so that we didn't repeat the mistakes that had been made in the past, of just designating women's clubs and YWCAs, all of which are incredibly important. I am in no way disparaging those women's institutions, but they tend to focus on a very kind of specific sort of socioeconomic and racial class of women from a very specific period of time in Los Angeles. We wanted to hear who are the women in your neighborhood, in your community, in your work who really resonate with you, and how can we help you bring those stories to the fore through our work, whether that's through designation or some other means. And so, unfortunately, Lindsay Mulcahy isn't here, but she was the director of outreach for the LA Conservancy at the time. And these numbers, I think, are low. Like, we did so many outreach meetings just over coffee, over lunch, and it was really, really critical that we just use this as a way to introduce the goals and values of LA Women's Landmarks to them, and then invited them to participate in whatever way they wanted. Maybe that was just telling us, giving us a list of a couple of names or a couple of places or a couple of women's stories that they felt really passionate about. Some of them have become incredibly significant project partners as well and are actively involved in helping us do this work. And so we wanted to really honor all of that information that they're sharing with us and honor the ways in which they choose to partner with us. And so even if we don't designate places, we also aren't able to designate the places for a whole host of reasons. We want to make sure that we're still thinking about how we communicate those stories in a lot of other ways. And this work isn't done. Like, this is a lot of outreach we've done, a lot of names that we've compiled and potential sites. This work is ongoing, constantly talking with folks, reaching out to new people, having meetings with folks, and growing that list of potential landmarks. Because my goal is to create a 30-year work plan for the Office of Historic Resources for how we finally start getting close to something that is gender equity in our representation.
That's great. Expanding on that also, one of the aspects of this project that I think is so important and unique is that you're looking beyond just processes for preservation, but there's an important public component to this work too. Can you talk a little bit about how you are sharing some of this information that is relevant to a public audience?
Yeah, so if you can go to the next slide, please. And Arabella can speak to this. Like how hard was it like to find the nominations? Like just because somebody nominates something and it gets designated, then what happens? Like where does that information go? And what did you have to do in order to be able to even get access to
Yeah,
those?
so some were available through our LA City Clerk Connect, but others I had to actually reach out to the Office of Historic Resources and they had to find the old scanned PDFs because not all were available to the public. So I did have to reach out, but they've been able to give them to me. So starting there is very helpful.
We have been able to get those, but that means that you have to understand the system, you have to
Exactly.
understand who to contact, you have to go ask for them to share a copy of it with you. So that means that even for these designations where there was already women's history represented in some way, nobody was seeing that. Nobody was learning from that. No one was benefiting from that. So to me, this project is not successful unless we have some really robust and creative and engaging public-facing aspects to this work, which is also why the partnership with the LA Conservancy is so important because they are known for their programs and their tours and their activities that we do. So we're doing a lot of different things, and we are also doing a lot of these in partnership with local institutions and organizations. But in short, two of the things that we're doing to make sure that these women's histories become a part of people's understanding of LA history are, one, creating a whole new series of tours and events and activities that will be led by the LA Conservancy that are built around these sites and stories of women that we're identifying through LA Women's Landmarks. So as people go on a Los Angeles, an LA Conservancy tour, they're going to be learning about intersectional women's history now from those programs. The other piece is that I really want young people to understand that women's history is LA history. So we are partnering with UCLA's History and Geography Department to develop at least 10 or 11 new curriculum for K through 12 students, again, driven by the research and the sites and stories that we've identified through LA Women's Landmarks, so that students in LAUSD schools, LAUSD are our public schools here, which is a huge school system, will have the opportunity to learn about women's history as they are learning about California and Los Angeles history. And to me, that is absolutely critical. And the work that the Conservancy and I are going to be doing on those educational programs is going to be tied to reinforcing that so that the programs will be aimed at students and young people and families so that all of these things kind of work together. Because if girls and boys don't see themselves reflected in the history of the places that they learn about and they visit, then they don't see the potential in themselves. Like we really want them to see that women are a part of history. I think you can go on to the next slide, please. And Arabella, you get to talk about all of these fun components.
Yeah, that's me on there. That's I the part of this is also creating video histories and kind of short form documentary for social media that we've been able to spotlight not only just the people who have done the work, so not just myself, but you have up at the top Zoe Detweiler at USC, Eliza Jane Franklin at USC, and Melissa Miller at USC, who did the research, who are being featured as they are then featuring women's stories. So this I had my own video done. I've also gotten to be a part of kind of behind the scenes at other students' videos. It's been an incredibly fun process, learning how to share these stories after doing so much research and then also see people engage with them. So these videos are actually available on the Conservancy website on our LA Women's Landmarks page if you're interested in looking at all of them. But it's this social media campaign between USC and the LA Conservancy. And then we've also, next step, I think Sarah Pilecki is going to take the lead on this, is going to be a GIS-powered story map of LA women's history. And so looking towards that in the future, thinking all these different ways that we can share history in the interim as this amendment process gets kind of worked through.
Yeah, we're going to start building out the base of the story map this summer with Sarah and another USC graduate student, hopefully, because we wanted to have a place where people could actually interact with all of this information. Like I said, we're making curriculum, we're doing oral histories, we're doing new designations, we're doing amendments. It's a lot. And so we wanted to have one place where people could go. And whether you're somebody who's just interested in how do I even get started researching a woman in my neighborhood or a woman in my family, like where do I even begin to go to do that research? Or you're an educator who's looking for a curriculum that you can use with your fourth grade class that's focused on local history. We want to give people multiple ways to engage with all of this information and all of this content, and then figure out how they can use it best for their own needs in their own communities.
Chris and Arabella, that's great. I did see a comment come in backstage that I just want to emphasize that yes, we are talking a lot about LA, a lot about California, but the toolkit we've put together is really built for people across the country to dig into and try this in their own space. And so, Sarah, next slide. So we wanted to tell you what we've put into the toolkit, which as I went through everything and helped them build it, I found to be incredibly valuable. So we have sort of a start. When you open the toolkit, you'll see a sort of a starter document that lists all these different pieces in along with credit information. And Chris has done, and I'll talk a little bit about this, and then if you guys want to jump in, if that's okay. We've got things to get you started, the slide deck from this webinar, the like step-by-step guides and how to get started, the evaluation information, the impact score spreadsheets. We haven't really talked about the research piece, the research guide. So Arabella, if you want to talk a little bit about that right now.
Yeah, so it's an Excel sheet. You kind of sort through it as you see fit, kind of different areas where you could just get started with the research. So I have focus on open access databases and resources. There is like an LA specific tab. So if you are in LA and want to look through that, but there's also information of how to build your own nominations, kind of based on our systems here in LA, but also nationally. So sort through that. And then Sarah Pilecki did some great research on how to find open access images that you can use as well. So kind of a choose your own adventure situation.
Yeah, so there's material here that's generalized. The impact score template has an example for Etta James, but like it's generalized enough that you can make adjustments for your own goals and your own visions. But we've also included things that Arabella has done, like a presentation on the HCM project from July, her research project, only because we think it's sometimes helpful to see concrete examples about this work in progress so you can see how you can do it in your place. So again, even though it seems like we've been talking a lot about California and LA, we've been very intentional in putting this toolkit together to apply across the country. And we also included a copy of the story that Colleen has been sharing that Sarah wrote, just in case for some reason you can't access the internet or the story disappears for some reason. We thought we wanted to make sure that that was enshrined here as well. So really, it's about 2:48. So I think I'm going to hold this last question so we can get Adrian on here to talk. Adrian Scott Fine is here. He is the CEO and president of the Los Angeles Conservancy. Adrian, are you there?
I am. Hi there.
Hi, Adrian. Hello. So Adrian is someone I've known for a very, very long time. He used to work at the National Trust when I was very young and just started here. And Adrian, our question for you was, you know, as someone who has this breadth of experience in historic preservation, we thought it would be nice if you could comment on why the Conservancy has agreed to make this huge commitment and why it's important for LA and LAC in particular.
I mean, all the things. First of all, thank you, Arabella and Chris, for outlaying a lot of work in a very intense platform. You can't imagine all the conversations and focus that we've been looking at on this. I mean, all the things that, has already been said. This was really important that, there's missing stories. They're not included, not reflected in the places that we're currently, including in our list of historic cultural landmarks across the, monuments and landmarks across the city of Los Angeles. And so if we want to tell fuller stories and be really authentic and accurate in doing this work, we need a different model, a different approach. And that was really what led to this idea of how can we partner and collaborate, which easier said than done. We always say, let's partner, let's collaborate, let's figure out a way to work together. And this one, I think, really, I think Chris and I definitely lost some brain cells thinking through, what does this look like? And also structuring a memorandum of agreement that would be very clear and saying, okay, this is how we're going to do it over multi-years of working in collaboration. What does that look like? But also this idea of shared fundraising, which I'm happy to talk more about. But that was a big piece of this. Like, and Chris mentioned, we only have so much bandwidth and resources to be able to do this, and we need more. But how do we actually do that in partnership? And that's where I think the rubber really hit the road in terms of like, what does that look like? How do you do that? And that's, not as it just a model for what we're doing in Los Angeles and, with a national organization and a citywide local preservation nonprofit, but the idea of how can other places do things like this in collaboration and partnership? If we can also pave the way about how to break down some of those barriers and turf issues and the willingness to fundraise and collaboration, that's going to pay off for others as well.
Thanks, Adrian. That's amazing. And I know from Chris, like hearing from Chris, just how great the partnership has been over the last couple of years. And I'm really excited that we all get to work with you all more and all the time, which is wonderful. So we're going to go to Q&A real quick. Sarah, if you can drop the slides. I'm going to ask the first question, but before we do that, there's a question in there about the links are going to be live in the story. It's actually in the toolkit there are two buttons at the top and the bottom of the story for downloading the toolkit. It's actually a zip file that contains all the different elements together. And I realized I skipped a slide there, so we'll go back to that after we answer some of these questions. Can you guys tell us?
Priya, before you move on, I just want to say, we hope these are intended to be for everyone to use. We hope you will give them a try and let us know what you think. This is our first attempt at starting to build this toolkit. So your feedback is very much welcome as you start to look at these and use these.
Great. What I was going to ask you guys, if you have any advice on how people get started, and that's sort of the kickoff question.
Arabella, do you want to go first?
I can start with what I think was most helpful to me when I got started was just knowing your local designation process of, again, knowing the people to contact, who to ask questions, and knowing where to find information. It might be bouncing between different websites, but I think that was the most helpful for me doing research, was actually knowing a little bit more about the system that we work in.
I actually wrote a piece called Some Simple Steps on How to Get Started. So I would encourage everybody to go look at that. But for me, it's really just thinking about being very realistic about what it is that you want to try to accomplish. I'm very cognizant of the fact that this is a huge multi-year project, and that can be incredibly daunting for a lot of people. Just pick something that you want to try to focus on. And if that is, do you want to be able to amend your existing nominations, not just to be able to add women's history in, but all people's history that is underrepresented? That's a process that we can kind of give you some guidance on and help you figure out how to do that. But if you want to do something like pick some aspect of this that is meaningful to you and make it right-sized to what you're actually capable of doing. Like, this is ambitious. That's why we gave ourselves 3 to 4 years to do this work. Pick something that you think is going to be really valuable to you and your community and the people that you work with, and just focus on that.
Thank you, Rhonda. I think you have a question from
Yeah, I mean, Adrian touched on this a little bit, but there was a question about how you assembled these strategic partnerships and fundraise and built momentum for the initiative.
The strategic partnerships have kind of, like I said, that's been an evolving process. That's why the partnership with the Conservancy was so incredibly important. Even though I'm based in Los Angeles, I haven't been here for 40, 50 years like the Conservancy has. And so being able to work in collaboration with folks like Lindsay and Adrian to kind of be able to do that outreach and talk with people who they know and work with on a regular basis, who are doing preservation on the ground, was invaluable. If I had to figure out all all of those relationships myself, that would have been incredibly challenging. And so really thinking about partnerships are beneficial in two ways. And often then as we expand those partnerships, those become even more beneficial too. So the relationship with USC through Arabella and Trudy, that then spawned the creation of a new course in heritage conservation at USC about how to amend nominations. So just really be open to those new introductions and those new partnerships, because I have been blown away by what each new partner, what ideas and opportunities they bring to the work that we're doing.
I'm just going to add to that also is that this allows all of the partners to have a piece of this and to go further. If this was just on the shoulders of one partner, it would not happen. And so I think that's the other beauty of this is that we're all taking a piece of this and sharing it. And sometimes we're in the lead, sometimes we're in the back seat while someone else is driving the car at that moment. But that, I think, allows this project to go much further than otherwise would be possible.
So one of the questions I think we might want to answer has to do with the impact scoring system. So Arabella, I think this is you. How did you determine the categories for the scoring system? Did you run into any challenges in assigning a numerical value to more complex situations?
Yes. So that first section I talked about that was like a checklist. That was actually Lindsay was very helpful for that. It was basically the kind of when the Conservancy evaluates projects, what do they look at? And we kind of adapted that to have its own system. The second part of the question of assigning point values for the second part, yes, that was a conversation of how do we actually build that out. But we really thought that impact scoring is very project specific for us. So we have the template for you, but adapt it however you need for your project and for wherever you work. Because for us, that was just how we determined priority. Like, is this something that requires a lot of urgency because it's under threat? And, community partnerships at the core of this project. So we wanted to incorporate that in some way. And then having that weighted scoring system in the second section kind of allowed us to take in kind of different situations. That weighted value was really helpful, but that was certainly something that Chris helped me with a lot. Like I'm the ideas person, but Chris made it fully functional. So yeah, so it took a lot of conversation, a lot of back and forth, and really focused on project goals specifically.
So it's kind of like a side question related to this, but one of our audience members wanted to know if you used AI in any of this work.
I did not know. So
I'm afraid this was all human brain power behind
yeah.
Do we have time for one more question?
I mean, it's 2:57. I think maybe one more, and then we can do the
Sure.
closing slides. Yeah.
Sure. Someone was asking about the difficulty of designations that don't have architectural significance, and if you could speak a little bit about that.
Mhm. We were initially conceiving of this, we kind of thought about the new designations as well as the amendments in kind of groups, and some that were just going to be obvious because they really were very architecturally significant and because they had told a very clear women's story and there were all sorts of resources and recognition to make that happen. We also understood that there were going to be a lot of cases like with the studio of Sister Mary Carita Kent, where the nature of the architecture or the condition of the architecture was going to immediately kind of raise questions, even though integrity isn't a category, it isn't a criterion that they are supposed to be evaluated on per the Los Angeles ordinance. It always gets thrown into the mix somehow. And I know that has been an issue with every form of designation that exists under the sun, is this whole integrity issue. So we really wanted to be thoughtful about how, and like Arabella was saying, we have this kind of precedent setting category within the impact scoring system. How are we continuing to push the boundaries around things exactly like that? Maybe this is someone whose story isn't well known. Maybe this is someone where the resources are going to be very challenging, or maybe this is a site where the condition of it has been altered in a way that it makes it challenging to see that particular period of significance. How can we help create a new model with our designations to show how that can be possible in the future, as opposed to just accepting, oh, well, the integrity isn't as great as we would like it to be, so we're just not going to bother. And Adrian, please answer this question because you've been doing this in LA for years.
No, I think you touched on. I mean, I think it's been something we've been sometimes gently, sometimes more forcibly, chipping away at. that, significance is not just in the architecture and this whole long sorted, saga about integrity and how that's evaluated. What's interesting specifically to LA is integrity is not part of the criteria in terms of, consideration of eligibility. That's unique to LA. The other aspect is there's no time limit. You don't have to be a certain age to be considered for a local historic cultural monument in the city as well. So there are some things that are already embedded in the city's cultural heritage ordinance that are helpful to us. And now we're working towards how do we overcome the other barriers that need to be addressed.
Great. So we're at time. We have a couple of closing things. So Sarah, if you don't mind popping the slideshow back up.
And Priya, I just want to remind everybody, this is our first set of tools. This is a multi-year project, so there will be a lot more coming out of this as we get deeper into this work. I hope you all will stay tuned and find value in those other phases of the work too.
Right, and so we wanted to share how you could follow along. The URL to the LA Women's Landmarks Project on LAC's website is here. We'll include that also in the follow-up email. Was there anything else you guys wanted to add to this? No?
Thank you.
Yeah, so Colleen, we will also share a link to where those great videos are that Arabella talked about. And Colleen has also dropped in a link, irrespective of this presentation, for when additional for our training webpage. So when additional information or trainings we might have on the subject come about, just make sure you're signed up for our webinar and training email. Again, we will share everything with you in the follow-up email. We're really thankful that you all are here as we dumped a lot of information on you. Please let us know what you thought about this format. If there's other information that you want help with. And if we didn't get to your questions, I do have the spreadsheet and I will share them with Chris and Arabella. And if they are able to answer them directly, they will. And with that, thank you, Adrian, Arabella, Chris, Rhonda, Sarah, and Colleen for this webinar today. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you to all the dozens of partners who are helping us do this work. We wouldn't be able to do it all without you guys.
Bye.